Cool. Hi everyone. My name is Iyana Simba and I'm IAC's City Programs Director. Today I'm going to be joined by Tiffany Sostrin and talk about how you can get involved in the Chicago legislative process. How does City Council work, similar to what we've done for the Springfield level. Before we hop in, I just want to share just a couple of slides, just a little bit about IEC and just who we are for folks that maybe aren't familiar and sort of just wanted to sign up for a CLE session. So IEC, we have been around since 1975. And really our work is to build power for the people and the environment. And so we do this through advocacy, movement building, collaboration, and overall just building power for folks throughout the state. We cover a range of different issue areas, including water, waste, sustainable agriculture, pretty much everything environmental in the city and in the state we cover. And one of the benefits of being part of the IEC network and joining 150 affiliate members is being able to know about what happens in City Council, what happens in Springfield, and just generally how to get involved. So that is a little bit of background about IEC. I just wanted to share that before we hop all the way in. And now I'm going to introduce Tiffany Sostrin, who is Managing Director at Daley Strategies. Prior to working government relations and political consulting, Tiffany spent 8 years working for the city of Chicago in a variety of roles. She most recently was the Director of Legislative and Community Affairs at the Chicago Park District, leading legislative efforts with federal, state, and city governments, including liaising with elected officials and stewarding their work with the Park District. Tiffany also served Mayor Lori Lightfoot as Deputy Director of Intergovernmental Affairs, where she oversaw all legislative activity for the City Council and maintained strong professional relationships with the aldermen. She was the primary legislative advisor for senior mayoral staff and city department leadership, including the development of strategies for engagement with City Council. During her time, she successfully executed the mayor's legislative and policy initiatives, including a sweeping ethics reform, the passage of the nation's most expansive Fair Workweek legislation, and the 15 minimum wage, and managing City Council's emergency COVID-19 response. Tiffany also serves as the assistant director and also served as the assistant director in the city's Department of Finance and as an attorney for the city's Legislative Reference Bureau under the President pro tempore Margaret Loreno. Prior to her career with the city of Chicago, Tiffany worked as a management consultant for IBM, served U.S. District Judge Sharon Johnson Coleman, and interned for the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. Tiffany has a bachelor's in public policy from Indiana University, Bloomington, graduated cum laude with the JD from Loyola University, Chicago, and completed a fellowship at the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy. Tiffany volunteers with a variety of organizations, including Big Shoulders Fund, Black Women Lawyers Association of Greater Chicago, and the Cook County Bar Association. She lives in Chicago, in Chicago's Lincoln Square neighborhood, with her 2 children, Lonnie and James, and her husband, Tim, and her dog, Miles. Tiffany, thank you so much for joining us. I'll pass it over to you to share your slides, and I'll stop sharing the IEC stuff, and we will jump into the civics training.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to see everyone's faces, or at least their little icons today. I'm going to try to be as interactive as possible and take pauses for questions throughout. We might have to pace them out based on how things are going. But I hope this is at least an interesting CLE and not a very boring one, because we've all been there. Let me present this. All right, can everyone see this? Does it look good to everyone? Excellent. Okay. So we all know why we're here. I'm not going to go through that. This is what we're going to discuss today. I'm just going to do some high-level background because I don't know what everybody on this call knows. Just to give a little framing about how City Council is organized and some background on the city. We'll dive right into the nitty-gritty, discussing some of the City Council committees, the rules of order, how a bill becomes a law. City Council in the news is a little iffy. That's more of a discussion. So we'll get there and hopefully we'll have lots to talk about. So this is an org chart of the city of Chicago. And I think one of the things to really notice here that's important is that the mayor is the chief executive of the entire city. So all of those different departments that you hear about, budget, even the Board of Election Commissioners, the police board, all the way down to both airports and trash pickup. The mayor is responsible for all of those things and chooses leadership for all of those different parts of the city. One of the things that you will maybe notice that is missing here is that there are sister agencies that are not present because the mayor does not have executive authority over those. So that includes things like Chicago Public Schools, city colleges, the Chicago Park District, the Chicago Transit Authority. He has authority to recommend and add people to the board, and he makes suggestions, but those recommendations are usually confirmed by the board of the agency itself, or by city council. The other roles to really take note of are city council, which are our 50 elected aldermen, the city clerk, who is currently Anna Valencia, and the city treasurer, who oversees the city coffers, and that is Melissa Conyers Irvin. And her husband is actually an alderman, Jason Irvin. All right. I showed a ward map here. It's kind of complicated and I didn't want to get into the nitty gritty. But I do want to just sort of explain that Chicago, and everybody you should know this, right? Chicago is really 50 different cities all in one, and every ward is its own little fiefdom, and it has its own set of issues and set of personalities. So this is sort of how it's broken up, and we'll go into more detail. And if you want to see a better ward map, I can certainly send you one. But this includes, and you'll see how some parts are enormous, like the 41st ward has a little arm there, that's for the airport. So yeah, that's it. All right, now you can see the words here, so I'm not going to talk you through all of it. But one of the things that I think is really too important to remember about Chicago and its history is that Chicago really has a strong racial history, right? Race politics in Chicago have always been incredibly divisive. And a lot of our leadership typically represents that. We have 50 aldermen. There are a number of caucuses at city council, so I'm not going to purport to know all of them, but I think there are some of note, and these are some of the largest ones, which is the Black Caucus, which has 20 members. Latino Caucus is also now, and also I should say this, is that even though the caucuses, like the Latino Caucus, not all Latino members of the city council are actually a part of the caucus for various reasons. There have been disputes, there have been just parting of ways. Some people come and go. Not everyone identifies with the identity of the caucus itself, so don't necessarily look at the list of names and think that that's going to reflect how many people are in the caucus or who is in the caucus. Another thing to note is the Progressive Reform Caucus. That caucus has grown significantly over time, particularly during the Emanuel administration. It really started to gain a lot of momentum and actually sort of started to become a thorn in the mayor's side. And then when Lori Lightfoot was elected, right, she probably would have been a member of what was or what is the Progressive Reform Caucus. And they really pushed the envelope, I think, in a different way that city council had never seen before. And now that we have a progressive mayor, right, who is he butting heads with? And I guess there's a little bit of a more conservative contingency that's rising up. But there's also some discontent within the Progressive Caucus. And right underneath that, I have the Democratic Socialists. That's also a caucus that has seen people come and go. People have been censured, kicked out. Some people have joined on. But they tend to be even far more left than the Progressive Caucus. And usually the DSA members are part of the Progressive Reform Caucus. One other thing to note is that these caucuses have no requirements. So it's not as if you have to vote a certain way or have a certain meeting or have a certain budget. There's really no real authority conferred to anyone by being a member of this caucus. I think there's a lot of informal authority, but not official authority. Another thing to note, and I think it's important here when you see the names of the different caucuses, is there used to sort of be this shorthand at city council, which was called the rule of thirds. And so whenever you do anything, you want to make sure that a third of the members are white, a third of the members are African American, and a third of the members are Latino. And that was a way to sort of placate everyone because that was generally what the makeup of the city was like. And so no one could ever say you're being unfair to a particular group of people. Now, obviously, that has changed significantly over time. We now have a ward that represents a large Asian population, and about 7% of the city's population is Asian. So you're seeing an adjustment there. You're also seeing more racial identifications, and you're also seeing racial groups in areas where there traditionally were none. So you're starting to see more Black people move up to the north side, which really was not as much of something that was happening in the 80s and 90s. Yeah, and there's been a lot of turnover at City Hall. So there are 16 new aldermen in the last 5 years, and most people are pretty young. I think most people are under the age of 47. So it's really an interesting city council right now. I skipped one? No. So there are 20 committees within the city council. And this is really where all the action happens. All of the significant legislative activity happens in committee meetings. This is where people have a lot of debate, discussion. Each committee has a chair. That chair has a lot of discretion. It also has a vice chair. The vice chair does not have as much discretion. But the aldermen themselves technically define the jurisdictions of every committee. Another thing that I think is really sort of critical to note is there are 20 committees and there are 50 aldermen. And so really what the committees kind of reflect is, I don't want to say cool kids versus not cool kids, but this list is almost a reflection of who is in the mayor's inner circle or who the mayor wants to be in their inner circle. That was particularly true during the Daley administration. If you were one of his committee chairs, you were golden, you were trusted. You knew that that person would always follow with the mayor's direction and do what the mayor asked of them. Another element of these committees is budgets. So every aldermanic office gets a baseline operating budget, right? And that is typically pretty low. It's usually enough to support having an office and 2 staffers. But if you have a committee, you get a lot more money. So back in the day when Ed Burke was chairman of the Committee on Finance, his budget for just the Committee of Finance was over $2 million, which is more than almost all of the other committees combined. And I think he had about 60 people on staff, and he had a tremendous amount of influence. He had security. He sort of had his own wing of City Hall. Everyone who knows anything about Ed Burke knows that he had a tremendous amount of influence over what happened at City Council. I actually helped sort of dismantle this system where your committee influence had a lot of influence over how much funding you had and how much influence you had as an alderman. So we went through and sort of did this massive audit of the actual work produced by the committee, how many times the committee met, and did some major adjustments and shifting around, not just to follow a tradition, but to follow with what makes sense. So you'll notice that when Mayor Lightfoot came into office, there was a massive reshuffling around of committees. Some new ones were created. The authority of committees was switched around a little bit to be a little more even. And those budgets were also significantly changed. We'll talk about this a little bit more, but you notice that I'm talking about the mayors coming up with these decisions and not the aldermen. And really, this is supposed to be a creation of city council and not a creation of the mayor. But in prior administrations, particularly Daley, Emmanuel, and even Lightfoot, and even this current mayor, he did it this way too. It's really difficult to organize this and get all 50 members of council to agree on who should be chairman of every committee and what their budget should be. And so sort of by default, because no one can step up and organize it, or no one has chosen to step up and organize it, the mayor has had a tremendous amount of influence over who becomes a committee chair, and what their budget is. And typically the rule that you would, and this is not true at all today, so don't hold me to it, is if you are committee chair, you will follow the direction of the mayor's office. This has not been the custom at all in the last few years, but it definitely was the case during the Daley administration. You always saw that his committee chairs always voted with him. And so for every initiative, automatically, he already had 20 votes or 23 votes or however many committees there were at any time. There was a guaranteed number of people that you knew would support him. I'm going to stop there briefly for any urgent questions or any points of clarification that anyone is looking for.
Yeah, I'm going to ask a question. Hopefully we'll spur some other questions here. I don't know if you're going to go into some of the mechanics of committee, but I've always been shocked of, like compared to Springfield going into these committees and like, there's no one there, amendments like just get filed when they're there. It just doesn't seem like there's, I know you talked about them setting their own rules, but it just doesn't seem like there are rules. Can you talk about like how some of that process works, and as you're trying to work your way through, how do you best follow what's going on with the committee? And maybe you're getting to that, but I thought I would just ask.
I am getting into that. That is the next section. It's brief, but there's actually a document called the Rules of Order and Procedure. So in combination with the Open Meetings Act, and the Rules of Order of Procedure, you should technically know everything that's going on and should have no questions about how things operate. Clearly that's not the case, but there is a rules of procedure, and I have links to that and can share that information with everybody if they want it later. But yes, that is a question that a lot of people ask. Anything else about committees? I can look at the chat briefly. Oh, I am sorry. Yes, people do, and someone pointed this out, and I apologize, but alder has been, or alder person has sort of been the adjustment to names to be gender neutral and just reflective of the city's progressive values and our recognition of people's gender identities. I think that in itself, right, the name of the elected officials themselves has been adjusted really is a good illustration of what city council has become. And I apologize if I slip. It was an adjustment that happened last year and I am still getting used to it, but I'm doing my best to try to say alder person, but also every individual alder person has a preference on really the prefix that they use. So, you try to be respectful, but there are some that like to be called alderwoman. There are some that only want to be called alderman and will get an attitude with you if you try to switch the game on them. So it's confusing for everybody. I think your safest bet is to always say alderperson. That generally is most receptive, but just know that there are caveats to this rule. And our aldermen or alder people, while lovely, are also rather finicky at times. All right. We are on to the good stuff, the rules of order and procedure. So these are the parliamentary rules and procedures that govern the city council. And I believe there are over 50 rules at this point. They are publicly available on the city clerk's website. I really strongly recommend that everyone briefly review them. What you'll notice is that the meat and potatoes of it all is really squished into rules 41 and 42. There are other meaningful rules, but if you know 41 and 42, you should generally be okay to understand what's happening at City Council. The rules are generally modified at the beginning of every 4-year term. However, they can be changed at any time through the appropriate process and full City Council approval. One of the things to note, and one of the most influential committees, is the Committee on Committees and Rules. It has a tremendous amount of influence, especially defining the committees, coming up with disputes over jurisdiction and referrals, ward redistricting, which just happened. That happens every 10 years, referenda, committee assignments, conduct, which has been really a major issue lately. I have never seen so many censures and resignations and calls for people to move on in my time at City Council. They also provide some services to the City Council, but really they kind of are how everything happens. They also include the Sergeant at Arms. So that includes the process for entering the chambers, signing up to testify on a particular item or at a hearing, who can be there, your behavior during the hearing. There have been people, and this has been also more of a current issue. There was a while where people were directed only to the top floor. I don't know if anyone's been, or most people have been to chambers, but there's an open area that has seating, kind of like a theater. And then all of the older people sit on the other side of a bar, and you can talk to them and speak over it. It's just at waist length. But then there's another section on the floor above that has a glass panel and stadium seating as well. And for some time, that's kind of where you put people the council didn't want to interact with, or people that were being problematic. It was called overflow. But it doesn't really provide the same level of interaction with the council as the main area. And so there have been quite a few disputes about access to what part of the council, what part of the chambers you can actually get into, and who can do that, and what you can do. And recently they've started using metal detectors and wanding people and having more strict rules about what you can bring in, what you can't. So it has changed quite a bit. But the City Council itself technically determines the rules of order and procedure. Again, this is another item where even though all 50 alder people are supposed to have input, generally this is created by the mayor and the mayor's office, and then council signs off on it. And we'll talk about how a meeting works later and how things flow. But I thought this was helpful context for just how things happen. Any questions about this piece?
Yeah, I added one to the chat, Tiffany. And going through the Chi City Clerk website, I noticed that the Rules Committee doesn't meet as often as the other committees. Is there a reason why?
Well, the committees are not required to meet on any besides zoning, which I will add a little asterisk there. The committees are not technically required to meet on any regular schedule. Now, as someone who has worked in administration, I will tell you that something I frankly said is I never want to have a rules meeting, because that is where all sorts of mischief can happen. People can move things around, they can come up with new budgets for committees, they can reassign committee members. And it's not like at the state where folks, I think people come in and out of committees and you swap it around a lot. That's not something that's generally done at City Council. You can try to take over chairmanships, you can help move items that you thought had sort of been banished to rules. There's a lot of chaos that can happen at a rules committee meeting. So you don't really want to have a lot of rules committee meetings as a mayor. And I think they try to limit the number of those meetings because it can get so chaotic and there's so many opportunities for people to do things that the administration or even their colleagues are not supportive of. I'm just looking really quickly in the chat if there are any other questions. And I'll talk more about committee meetings and how they happen and the schedule. Okay. All right. I know it's not called a bill, but everyone calls it a bill, but I just love how a bill becomes a law. It kind of reminds me of that Schoolhouse Rock. I'm going to try to do a lawyer's version of this, and hopefully I'll be just as memorable. But what is the legislative process in Chicago? Hopefully this next slide is not too confusing. So this is sort of the life of legislation in Chicago. First, a piece of legislation is submitted to the city clerk's office. It can take many forms. Typically, it's an ordinance, which is a change to the city code, a resolution, which directs action or makes some sort of statement on behalf of the city, or an order, which directs someone to do something very specific. The vast majority, 99.9% of legislation is usually submitted by the city council, the alder people, or the mayor. There is a method, and I won't spend too much time sitting on this, but there is a method by which members of the public can submit legislation. Former Governor Pat Quinn is really fond of using this method, so you'll see a few pieces that he's introduced over the years. But as a member of the public, you are allowed to introduce legislation for consideration. You send your legislation to the city's clerk's office where it's just processed, right? And then there's the next city council meeting, and those typically happen every Thursday of every month, with some exceptions. It's not the rule, it's just sort of that's your default. The items are introduced and formally assigned to a committee. They begin the legislative process. They're part of new business. And this happens at the city council meeting. And they meet every month except for August. That's when they're on recess. And that has been custom, but I don't know if that custom will continue. After the city council meeting and all of the and there are two tracks, right? So we're just talking about things that are being introduced, right? So new items, and then we'll sort of switch tracks later. At the meeting, the new item is assigned to a committee, and then typically there's a committee meeting set, and this is sort of in a perfect world, right? All of the legislation that's assigned to that committee would be placed on the agenda for that committee. And then the council or the members of that committee would vote on every item. That is not how it works. Meetings are set as needed. So there are committees that don't meet frequently. There are committees that don't meet every month. There are committees that don't need to meet every month, because every piece of legislation is not treated equally. Just because anyone can introduce anything doesn't necessarily mean that the council is willing to take it up as an item that is worthy of them voting on or being placed on an agenda. The decision on whether there's a meeting or not of a specific committee is decided by the committee chairman, and the items that are on the agenda are also decided by the committee chairman. So your next hurdle after you've introduced something is to get your item actually placed, get a committee meeting set for your item, and then get your item placed on the agenda. Assuming all goes well, they vote on your item and the committee, and it's just the members of the committee, and that cannot be adjusted or switched. There is a provision for the president pro tem to he is a member, or that person is a member of every committee and can vote if they choose to. But as long as your item passes out of committee, typically at the next city council meeting, the chairperson of the committee reports it out and the full council takes a vote on it. and then it becomes a law. And depending on what it is and what the specific rules are, will affect when it becomes a law, but typically it's 45 to 60 days, unless the mayor decides to veto it. So, yeah, that's kind of the overall life cycle. I'll get into more details. We talked about this a little bit, but anyone can introduce legislation. But typically the person introducing that legislation decides what committee it goes to, right? So in this group, a large majority of what is done here will go to the Committee on Environment, right? However, there are some times where maybe the chairman of the committee doesn't like you, or maybe you don't like the chair, or maybe they're out and the vice chair is filling in, or there are some elements to the piece that you're submitting that could technically be the jurisdiction of a different committee. Like it might have some crossover with finance, or zoning or something like that. You would say, I prefer that this item be sent to this committee. And then when the clerk reports it out to the full council, that is sort of where it is suggested it goes. Any questions about that? Or rather, I'll talk about this later. But yeah, any questions about that? Okay. Are there joint referrals? Yes, there can be joint committees, and there can also be special committees. So you could send an item to a committee on zoning and environment, right? If it has some zoning element, and then members of both committees would be able to vote on that item, or need to vote on that item when it's up for consideration. The city council meeting itself is confusing and they are incredibly long. I've sort of grouped them into sections here so y'all can understand the flow. The first item, 1 through 6, they're typically just the mayor calls the meeting to order. They do the Pledge of Allegiance, they do an invocation, there's public comment. But that can go on for a really, really long time, right? That's usually the first 45 minutes to an hour of city council meeting is just items 1 through 6. Something to also note is ceremonial resolutions. And those are resolutions that just say, you know what, I would like to honor Jennifer Walling for all of her contributions to the environmental community. Let's read something nice about her. She's here, she's gonna sit, it's called In the Box. It's a little seating area to the left of the mayor's dais. And maybe Jen will be there, maybe she won't. But usually all of the aldermen or all of the alder people that have a relationship with her will get up and say nice things about her, and everyone will clap, and it's all great. But that also takes a really long time. And so depending on the number of ceremonial resolutions and what month it is, if it's Black History Month or whatever, it could be another 2 to 3 hours of the city council meeting. And that typically is done during, it is supposed to happen in item number 12. But what will happen is one of the alder people will make a motion for suspension of the rules, which means I don't want to do anything that the rules of procedure say, and I don't want to follow the agenda of the meeting. I would like to do whatever I want. And usually they'll make a motion for suspension of the rules and say, I would like to do presentation of resolutions. And then right after item number 6, they'll go into those ceremonial or honorary resolutions. After the pomp and circumstance, and usually a good amount of time has passed at that point, sometimes 2 to 3 hours, we'll hear reports and communications from the mayor, and that will be all of the legislation that the mayor is introducing at the city council. And it'll be assigned to committee. Now, I'm just going to check my own presentation. There is a point where there can be some disagreement about what committee an item goes to, but I'll move on. Then we have the reports of all the committees, which is a recap of what happened at their meeting. You'll hear something called call the wards, and that'll be all of the ordinances introduced by alder people. Any unfinished business, they'll set the next meeting. They have something called roll call on the omnibus, which just means is everybody here? And then they'll leave. You will hear this pretty often, or I don't know if you'll hear it pretty often, and maybe it's just something that someone like me hears a lot. But you can send something to the committees on rules, and that's called purgatory, banishment. It gets stuck, it's never leaving. But what happens is when the item is introduced to the full council, another alderperson or an alderperson can say, hey, I know that you said that that was supposed to go to the Committee on Environment, but I really actually disagree, and I think it should go to the Committee on Budget. So as that item is read out to the whole council, and it'll be loud, and you sort of have to just listen really clearly, someone will literally just scream out the name of a different committee, and then that item is automatically sent to the Committee on Rules, and it has to overcome another legislative hurdle. This is a move that people used to do all the time if they didn't want someone's legislation to move, because one, as we said, the Committee on Rules doesn't really meet a lot. And two, it requires another hurdle, right? It delays the process. It now requires a convening. The Committee of Rules is a committee of the whole, so all 50 aldermen are members of it. It involves a convening of all 50 alder people to agree on what item this committee, or what committee this item should go to, and then it goes to that committee. So it could delay things a month, it could delay things several months, but getting stuck in rules is not a good thing, and you don't want your legislation stuck there. Again, we talked about this, committee hearings and votes. Not every committee meets every month, though with regularity, you can generally predict that finance, budget, and zoning are also going to meet. There are also some other committees like transportation that have a public way that process some sort of street permit or some sort of like administrative functions. Those committees will meet frequently, but it's always a sure thing that finance, budget, and zoning will meet at least once a month. There is also something called a direct introduction. So previously I said, and here you can see legislation is submitted to the city clerk. It goes through the process. You can typically send it to rules. You can have all these shenanigans. But you could also at a committee meeting say, hey, I've got something that I need the committee to take up right now. It's an emergency, or, something else happened, or, it was a repetitive item. Sometimes they'll do that for administrative pieces. Even though it's usually generally not truly an emergency, and really just a way to kind of hide the item, a direct intro can be a very helpful parliamentary rule. And it's not disclosed to the public in advance, right? So it sort of flies in the face of the Open Meetings Act. But it is something where a piece of legislation that you've never seen or heard of before can be given directly to the committee members for consideration before going for consideration by the full council. Another thing to note is a motion to discharge. I don't know if anybody's been following the city clerk's site very closely, but Alderman Ray Lopez recently filed a lot of these. If your legislation has not been heard by the city council within a certain amount of time, the sponsor, or really any alderperson, can force the item to be considered immediately and not sort of delayed or hung up by just not being on the agenda. That does not happen often, and lots of people are not successful in this. And a lot of legislation is just filed because they wanted to file it and they knew that nothing was going to happen with it. But it is a procedural move that's available if your item is not being heard. Let's see. There's another rule, and this is the last like picky, boring rule I'll tell you about and it's hidden in Rule 41. It's called a D&P, or defer and publish, which means I'm going to defer a vote on this item, meaning I don't want the council to vote on it today. And I would like it to be published in the City Council Journal of Proceedings, which is a document that's produced after every council that sort of explains everything that happened. It's very long. Published in the journal that this happened, and no one can vote on it. That also delays things, because usually if it's deferred and published, you have to wait until the next city council meeting to vote on the item. However, if it's something that is incredibly important, or the mayor really wants it to move, due to the Open Meetings Act, there typically can be another council meeting scheduled, a special council meeting scheduled 48 hours after the meeting where this item or this procedural move is used. So 2 days later, there'll be another full meeting of the city council. Or you could wait until the next regularly scheduled meeting on every third Wednesday. Another thing to note is just called roll call. And that is also something that the alder people will just shout out during the meeting. So they take a vote at the beginning of the meeting on some non-controversial item, and everyone votes yay or nay. And everybody votes yay, right? And that is used as the vote of record for approving things en masse. So non-controversial items, the vast majority of things are just, that vote that's taken at the beginning, the result of that vote is applied to every item that proceeds after that. So it's just a quick way to process through all of the legislation that happens at City Council. However, if something is controversial, they'll do what's called a roll call vote, and they will not apply that default vote, and instead require every member present at the council meeting to vote on the record about the item. And it used to not be super transparent. Now there's electronic voting, and it's actually, you can see how people voted and how they're voting during the meeting, but it used to not be public. So something that people would do, it's called taking a walk, which would mean I'm here at the meeting, but at the time that we're going to vote on this item that is controversial for one reason or another, I'm just going to go to the bathroom and not be present, and everybody can vote without me. So yeah, that's a roll call. I'm sure you've all heard that shouted out during a meeting. Oops, I'm sorry. I'm having some technical issues. Any questions about that, or any questions at this point about how legislation moves through the process and what happens at the council meetings? I know I moved really fast, but we didn't have a ton of time to go over everything.
Yeah, I guess I have a quick question. So I haven't attended a city council meeting. I was just curious, do they generally follow Robert's rules?
Yes, generally, if it's not covered by the city council rules of procedure, then Robert's Rules of Order is the default. And also something else to note is city council is a creature of state law. And actually, this is the next slide. Y'all are so good at just kind of anticipating everything that I'm going to say. The mayor has the authority. The mayor's authority is granted by state law, right? And also city council is a creature of state law. And so that's also created by state law. And within that, it says that the mayor can veto legislation if they choose to, but also that the city council exists because of state law. And then the members can vote on whether to accept the veto or not. I've never seen this happen. maybe it has happened in previous years, but certainly not in recent memory. But yes, they either follow state rules if the state has chosen to speak on it, or they follow city council rules of procedure, or the final place for things to go is Robert's Rules of Order. So I keep a little pocket version with me at all times.
I have a question to Tiffany. You mentioned the part about the main gallery, and then what I call there, it's called overflow. I call it the peanut gallery. I hate sitting up there. But do you know exactly what the rules are for people interacting with alders on the floor? Because it's weird. I've been in city council where sometimes someone will go up and speak to somebody and the sergeant at arms comes over, and then other times people would just sit, or sometimes the alder will even come out and they'll talk in the background. I'm just wondering, like, what is the official rule for interacting with alders on city council floor?
It depends on who you are. So if you are a former alderman, you have privileges to walk the floor. You have run of the full council at any time. If you are a registered lobbyist, there are some bans on how you can interact with city council and if you're supposed to talk to them during the meeting and if you can discuss things while they're standing on the actual council floor. If you are a member of the public, I think the general rule is to behave with decorum and don't be offensive. I think the City Council Committee on Rules has published a guide, but it's very general. So it doesn't really prohibit any specific conduct, but you can generally assume that you should not yell, you should not scream, you should not throw things. You can't they've in the past removed people who hold up large signs or start chants. But really it's incredibly subjective. And if the aldermen don't find your conduct offensive, people have a lot of freedom about what they can and can't do. So no, that's not really, I know that's not a clear answer, but the rules are also not clear. Someone in the chat has asked, oh, hold on, I got multiple questions. I have a question about committee meetings or subject matter hearings. Are there any evidentiary rules on information that is being presented? I mean, no, not really. I think you can present whatever you want. You know, if you share a copy of legislation, it should be a real version. You can't pass out flyers during the meeting, but no, there's no rules regarding like, is it truthful or not, or you know, is it honest or is it a fact? There are no rules about like the actual content of what is being presented. However, the chair has an incredible amount of discretion, and if they feel that you are going too far off script or are presenting falsehoods, your presentation can be cut short, right? The only people that are technically required to be able to speak at a council meeting or a committee meeting are the members of the public during the public comment period, and the other council members. Now they can ask people to come in and discuss their legislation at length or be experts or provide background, but that is at the leisure of the chairman of the committee and at the request of other members of the committee. It's certainly not a requirement. Let's see. I'm going to answer one more question from the chat. Any law and ordinance passes with many sections and subsection. If there is a section or subsection that is poorly written or merits reworking, how and where does this begin and will this come up? Well, I don't know. There's a somewhat infamous man at City Council. His name's Jeff Levine, but he used to be in the Department of Law and now he's at the mayor's office. But in every month there's a process, and I realize that not everyone sees this, but there are little worker bees behind the scenes all the time. So there's someone like me that literally prints out everything that's introduced to the city clerk's office. And before the meeting, we go through every item and read it. And if there are issues, if there are substantive issues, those things are flagged. If things are poorly written, usually the corporation counsel will intervene and ask for a rewrite or ask for amendments. But it really requires the diligence of folks in the law department and lawyers and a bunch of nerds reading over everything to make sure that everything holds legal muster and is clear. Any other questions? All right. I have included some helpful links. And I also would like to just say, I don't know if he's out there, but Jeffrey Cubbage from the BGA, his work and just summary was really helpful in background for preparing this. But I've included hyperlinks to the About City Council. So any sort of basic questions that you have, or if you don't have familiarity with how City Council works, there's a really great section on the clerk's site about how City Council works. I've also included a link to the rules of order and procedure. Sometimes you'll see people with these little booklets, and they're published by the Sergeants at Arms office. You have to be incredibly special to get one. I don't have one anymore, but that's where the rules of, that's also another version of the rules of order that you can find. ELMS, which is the Electronic Legislative Management System. That is where you can look up all legislation after it's been introduced and find out where it is in the process, what committee it's in, all the details. And then I've included a link to the state law because for some reason, this is just lots of people can't ever find it and don't understand how the veto works and the state authority empowering the mayor and council. So I've included a link to that. I see another question in the chat about how you amend a law. So I should have also included a link to the municipal code, but that is a collection of all of the city's laws written in order and sort of categorized appropriately. If you decide you want to change one, you would just submit an ordinance and there are rules about how you do it. But you want to identify the new language that you would like to insert and the language that you would like to remove. And then you submit it to the clerk and then it goes through the whole legislative process. There's no like administrative way to make corrections. It has to go through the entire legislative process. Any other thoughts, or questions, or gossip?
Tiffany, do you want to provide a little bit? I know Iyana's going to present a little after you have presented on some of the things that are ongoing. And so just for folks, and I put the CLE information into the chat if folks want to enter it there, but and just for everybody on here, that time doesn't count towards CLE. I do need to give that, but we do want to like focus on these places. I know you've worked with us a lot on Cabo. Do you want to just talk about maybe how some of these procedural items have been like a real world example that might be related to some of our environmental work? I know we're going to get to Iyana, but I just wonder if you could, you know, talk about how that's impacted.
Well, actually, Jen, I know you asked me a very direct question, Jen, but I'm not going to answer that question. I will answer that question, but I also just want to, this is something else that I thought about bringing up, but it was too much of a task. But the city budget process happens every October. And that is really like a huge process in which they determine how things are going to be funded throughout the city. And one of the things that the environmental community advocated for a really long time is the creation of the Department of Environment. And that is the type of thing that's included in the budgetary process. And so it sort of comes outside of this legislative process that we've talked about. But but that can be a great opportunity to move larger items or things that are fundamental to the functioning of the city. That happens during the budget process. With Cabo specifically, that item is, I believe, stuck in rules. So this is a perfect example. It was introduced by the mayor some months ago. And there was a lot of behind the scenes work that occurred before the item was even introduced. There were several revisions. There was a meeting of the minds between different interested parties about what should be included and what should not. And the mayor introduced it. I believe Alderperson Riley and Napolitano are working with some opponents to Cabo, and they decided that they would send the item to rules. I don't know what committee they yelled out, but they yelled out another committee and the item is stuck in rules. So now we're waiting on a rules committee meeting to happen where all 50 people vote on the ordinance before it can even be heard by the Committee on Environment. We're hoping that that happens soon, and there can be a rules meeting scheduled where determining what committee Cabo goes to, that could happen overnight, right? That can happen with 48-hour notice. So it's not a huge hurdle, and we're getting, I think we're getting to a place where we'll have some agreement about when that will happen. But that, I mean, that could happen in rapid succession. So we could have a rules meeting and then 48 hours later, have the environmental meeting, have a vote, and then 48 hours later, have a city council meeting and have a vote. So there's a lot of opportunity for Cabo to move forward quickly, but where it is now is it's stuck in the rules committee. And if there's, my guess is there may be some amendments, maybe it'll be adding things onto the ordinance or swapping them out. But that's something that can be done directly in committee. So there can be amendments made directly in committee. We can make adjustments. We can introduce a new diversion directly at committee. There's lots of opportunity with Cabo. It's certainly not dead or stuck anywhere, but it's currently sitting in the rules committee.
Thanks for that update. I think this might be good for, we're just going to do a little follow-up. I don't know if other people have questions want to put in the chat, but I know Iyana was going to present a little bit now on how our work has been intersecting with City Council.
Cool. Well, thank you, Tiffany, so much for the presentation. For this portion, I kind of just want to share a little bit about what IEC is doing and sort of why we're getting involved in some of the city work, and some ways that you all can support things like Cabo, Cumulative Impacts Ordinance, and participate in some of IEC's city work. So let me just pull this up really quick. Here it is. Okay, here we are. I will skip over this. We talked a little about IEC and beginning of the presentation. So our city work, here it is. So IEC, we've been engaging with the city on and off throughout the years, but most of our work has been in Springfield. We have a lot of partners here in the city that also engage, have been engaging with the city council as well. So this isn't necessarily new, but I would say probably around 2017, 2018 is when we really started to reach out more to Chicago alderpersons, and really through the pandemic is where we really ramped up our work with the city council as well as the mayor in engaging some of the different agencies. I think it's pretty obvious why it's important for us to engage in city policy, but I think really some of the biggest ones are a lot of what Chicago does can guide state or federal policy. Oftentimes, the city will look to Springfield, and then Springfield will say, well, if Chicago can do it, then maybe we can see if we can, the rest of the state can do it as well. And then just for an individual basis, it can be a lot easier to engage in. Tiffany kind of went over the lay of the land, you know, 50 alderpersons. I mean, technically you could have 25 votes to pass something with the mayor being a tiebreaker, but pretty much want 26 or more. For IEC and environmental folks, we often interact with, of course, the Environment Committee, but also transportation, zoning, health, and pedestrian and traffic safety. And so just to give you sort of a scope, this is based on what IEC we've looked at. The way we've sort of ranked some of the aldermen has been based off of their voting record. So we have an environmental scorecard that I'll mention later, but their voting record, what they brought up in city council hearings, have they actively tried to work against environmental legislation? Have they introduced environmental legislation? And so we did that initially in 2021 and then again later on in 2023. And green environmental champions are folks that they don't need a lot of pushing. We know that they're going to be for the environment throughout, regardless. Leans green are those folks that, for the most part, they're going to be into environmental issues, but they might need a little bit more persuasion from us or their colleagues. And then there's the unclear moderate. Some of these folks we have not engaged in too much, haven't really heard them say anything about environmental issues on the floor. And they're going to tend to be more moderate. So if there's a large group of folks in their caucus or their close colleagues, they'll tend to go environmentally focused. Leans anti-green, these are more folks that probably going to lean more towards industry, but in some cases might be pro-environment, so they might care a lot about lead service on replacement, but maybe not as much of a fan of zoning rules, so it can kind of be a mixed bag. And then there's folks that are just anti-green, where they have a really, really poor relationship with the environmental community and especially our environmental justice partners, and are pretty much going to go with industry regardless, and typically actively oppose environmental legislation when it's introduced. And I think it's been a lot of progress. You know, we've doubled our green environmental champions, we've doubled our leans green folks. A lot of that has to do with just the basic makeup of city council. So there were, I believe, 12 to 14 seats that were open. A lot of folks who came and were progressives, tend to be a little bit more environmentally friendly. But we still have a lot of folks that are in the middle, right? They're not necessarily going one way or another on environmental issues without being pushed. Or they're just very early in their career on city council and need a little bit more guidance. But I share that as just to show that this is sort of our IEC's take on city council. I won't get into specifics of who these alders are. That is a conversation, a power analysis conversation for IEC members, an internal conversation, but wanted to share the makeup of city council. I do want to shout out some environmental allies. So these are folks who have scored 100% on our environmental scorecards for 2021 and 2023. Many of these folks now chair different committees. Maria Haddon chairing the Environment Committee, La Spada chairing the Pedestrian and Safety Committee. Others like Matt Martin, Andre Vasquez were huge proponents for the reestablishing the Department of Environment, as well as the others here that have just been overall just supportive, engaged on environmental and environmental justice issues in City Council. And then I just want to share some environmental victories that IEC has supported. In 2021, the city, a part of their Chicago Recovery Plan, there was $188 million dedicated to climate infrastructure. That's a win. You know, we sent in recommendations about what we wanted to see as part of the recovery plan, and a lot of that was reflected in that budget. We will planning initiative. City now has 6 lead service on replacement programs with opportunities to replace your lead pipes, even for free in some cases. City committed to 100% renewable power for municipal owned buildings. We're still working on getting the residential ones electrified. We now have a Department of Environment. We have the cumulative impacts report that came out this past fall. And that sort of outlines what we already know about industry being concentrated in environmental justice, Black and brown and low income neighborhoods. And then we have the 2023 Mayoral Transition Report. Myself and Danny Robles, our climate policy director, we serve on the transition team and really worked with making sure that our goals amongst environmental advocates were included in that final report. And then just about the budget, I won't dive super deep into this, but again, there was a huge chunk of money for climate related initiatives, including lead service on replacement and decarbonizing low income homes. We have the Department of Environment now. Due a lot to some falling in COVID era funding, we did see some sort of environment related departments experiencing decreases in their budget, but I would say overall was not an anti-environmental budget. And then what we're really focused on and what I want to talk about a little bit more is one, continuing the expansion for the Department of Environment It was funded at 1.8 million in the past budget. I think now there's about 15 or so folks on staff, but we're gonna have to bring enforcement. We're gonna have to have some enforcement power back underneath the DOE. The previous department had around 75 folks. We have a lot more to work back. We need to get back to that place. The Clean and Affordable Buildings Ordinance, as Tiffany had talked about, this is putting us on a path to electrify residential homes. So starting with new ones, and that's able to meet our climate goals, but also to really increase the health of Chicagoans and improve indoor air quality. And then a cumulative impacts ordinance. So I spoke about the report that came out in the fall. The goal is to introduce a related ordinance, and this is support from the mayor, by the way. This is supported by the mayor, that would basically reform our zoning and planning process so that communities actually have a say-so in their zoning and planning process, that they can speak to whether or not a warehouse or a distribution center or whatever ends up in their neighborhood. And then speeding up lead service line replacement. Again, we have 400,000 lead service lines sprinkled throughout the city. We need to make sure people, we speed it up and that people can afford to actually replace their lead pipes and that people know about the actual process. Reducing the use of single-use plastics. I'm sure people are aware the city has a 9% recycling rate, but we also just need to stop plastics at the source. We need to get people away from using them. So we're working with the city on what that could look like. And then finally, just continuing to grow our relationships with city council and city agencies. And then this is just more of an exhaustive list. We have environmental fact sheets that sort of encompass all these other areas. So again, increasing recycling, 100% transition, clean energy transition, electrifying vehicles, electrifying our infrastructure, and more improved public transportation, bird-friendly design, all those things. And these are things when we're meeting with alders, we're discussing with them. So just as far as like a timeline where we're at now, Mayor Johnson just completed the first year of his first term, or what could be his first of many, but at least his initial term. Environmentally friendly budget, new Department of Environment. He's supportive of the Clean and Affordable Buildings Ordinance and the Cumulative Impacts Ordinance. But at the same time, I think anyone who is in Chicago and who is sentient knows that there are a lot of competing issues going on in the city right now. And so it's been a tumultuous first year, but we are looking forward to continue working with the mayor on more environmental legislation programs, whatever. June is sort of the unspoken start of the budget season where the city will start to really solidify its budget. August is the city council recess, and then September to December is going to be a huge focus on the budget. So having hearings, meetings, all of those things. So this is probably the most important part. Okay, so this is probably the most important part. The bullet point, you might not be able to see it, but I wanted to talk about how people can engage in the city council process. So now that you know how it works, there are ways to get involved. And the first bullet point that is very, very pale. I would encourage folks to contact your alderman about environmental issues that are affecting you in your ward. Aldermen are there, as Tiffany mentioned, there are these 50 different mini cities throughout Chicago. And so while you can always show up to city council, you can send things to the mayor in the mayor's office, your alderman is literally right there in your ward for you to talk to them. That being said, engaging in the public comment process is meaningful. I know someone in the chat mentioned that it can be difficult to be part of that. There's only 30 minutes for every committee and city hearing, but try to engage in it as much as you can, whether virtual or in person. Take advantage of social media. I think that's sort of a no-brainer now in these times. You have sort of a direct access to your elected official. If they're doing something great, talk about it on social media. If you see something that concerns you, talk about it on there as well. Following the city's legislative tracker. So if you go to shycityclerk.com, there it'll show whenever there's a hearing and you can watch it on the video, or you can also go and track the legislation going through city council and also seeing the different meetings and the different folks that are part of the different legislative bodies. A few other things, of course, listening to podcast, just being aware. I love a good newsletter, a good 5-minute read. Axios is really great. Tribe, Southside Weekly, WBZ also has one as well. Political, all those things are really great to check in, to look into. And then finally, what else can you do? Take action. So we have a action alert for the Clean and Affordable Buildings Ordinance. So it's at ilenviro.org, and then you can click on to where it says the Action Center, and then it'll be listed there to encourage your alder to support Cabo. And then I wanted to just share like a few other resources. So underneath the IEC website, our reports and analysis page, we have the 2021 and 2023 environmental scorecards. So this shows you that maybe you have an alder that says a lot of great things in the community and on the city council floor. This shows you how they actually vote. And then we have the IEC mayoral report, which lays out recommendations for the mayor over his the next 3 years of his term. And then become an IEC member. Be great. We offer a lot. You know, we have our policy expertise. We have our monthly city council report outs where I pretty much track every single piece of environmental legislation and send that out to our listserv. We have an annual agenda setting process, our biweekly city environmental calls, and then having access to our city council power analysis. So that breakdown of who's anti-environment or pro-environment, whatever, those are things that you would have access to. And just other ways to support IEC and our work, subscribe to our newsletter, follow us on social media, and just stay connected. We are constantly reporting out what we're doing in city council, as well as uplifting our affiliate partners' work. So that's my presentation. I think there might have been some questions in the comment section, but I do want to just leave it open now to folks if they have questions on my presentation or Tiffany's. We wanted to leave a little time for Q&A before we wrap up. So if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Also feel free to come off of mute.
I do want to pipe up again. So I don't think I mentioned this, full disclosure, but I'm one of the lobbyists that is working on the Clean Affordable Buildings Ordinance. And what we're really seeing is a need to engage with the Black Caucus. Earlier in my presentation, I said there were 20 members, right? So that is a key contingency that we need a lot of votes from. And they're hearing a lot from community members. They're hearing a lot from labor unions. And I think we really need to work closely with our labor partners, particularly in those areas, to make sure that everyone understands what the ordinance actually does and what's being asked of them. But also to make sure that those alder people know that their community members are engaged meaningfully. You can go to their office, you can go to their ward night, you can speak at public comment, you can send them emails, you can call, you can write them letters directly, you can schedule a one-on-one. There are a lot of alder people who will meet constituents for coffee. Whatever it is that you think you can do, particularly for some of the more moderate members of city council, it's easy to get a call or a meeting with a progressive alderman that cares a lot about the environment. It's a lot harder to meet with an alderman or alderperson that has been in council for the last 25 years and really waffles or is a little more conservative. So think a lot about that and think a lot on your connections and interactions with those people and reach out. I always say reach out in a respectful manner. No one wants to be met with anger or disrespect. But it is always good to hear from community members and community voices.
Well, this is the time if folks still have questions or, questions. You can always put thoughts in the chat or keep them to yourself. But this is the time if you have any questions. And if not, this recording will be available. We will have it on our YouTube page and it will be sent out to attendees. And I just want to say thank you everyone for joining today. I hope this information was very valuable. I learned a lot personally, and I hope others did as well. And look out for the recording that will come out early next week. So thanks everyone and have a great weekend.
Thanks, Iyana. I just, one last reminder
Oh,
for
sorry.
putting the link in for the continuing legal education. If you need to do that, make sure you put that in before the end of the day. Thanks.